Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and in this lesson, I'm going to talk about leading across race, ethnicity, class, and gender. So, as we talked about in the beginning of the course, um, most leadership theory and most books come from, whenever I say a white male perspective, it's not that they don't apply across everything. It's just a lot of the examples and a lot of the context have been assumed, with white men. So, for example, Clinton's book, Making of a Leader, almost all the examples are either Jewish men or white men, right? So, and there may be different lessons that we can learn if you make the circle a little bit wider, so to speak, right? So that's what we're trying to do in this course. In the previous lesson, I talked about, okay, if we're going to serve under-resourced communities, how might those things be translated a little bit differently? So in this, often in a lot of the more elite schools, secular schools, in academic teaching, they might focus on diverse leadership, but they're talking about usually middle class, and we're basically trying to cover both diverse and under-resourced in this course. Now, kingdom principles, looking at this and how to lead effectively across diverse and under-resourced communities. So one, we're called to identify with the oppressed. So I have an understanding of oppression in terms of life chances. So, what were your life chances given your race, class, gender, and other environmental factors? And what I mean by that is the life chances of, someone who's born, white male in the United States from a very affluent family. There's a pretty good chance they're going to go to college. There's a pretty good chance they're going to make, reasonable money. If someone is, born in a different category, then their chances are going to be different, right? So, and we're called to sacrifice for the oppressed. So Isaiah 58:10, and the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Matthew 20:16. So, second principle is we're all sinners, and we must all acknowledge our role in oppression and have the humility and mercy that comes with that. And recognize there's a limitation of identity frameworks. And our natural tendency is to emphasize the characteristics of our identity where we were oppressed. So, I grew up poor white, I'm male, and I really like to talk about class, right? But it's harder for me to have the race conversation and the gender conversation. So, and also just recognizing that all frameworks and perspectives are fallen and have limitations, including justice frameworks. So and they need to be combined with others. So even if you use the race, class, and gender lens, that doesn't mean you're covering everything in the universe, right? And it also means that there's never a context. A lot of academic theories really try to create context, and I would say that they've been built with the power politics mentality in mind, so that to basically say, if you're in this category, then you can never oppress anyone. And that becomes more of a challenge, I think, from a biblical perspective. So anyway, I think that the third thing to recognize is that our fallenness is both individual and collective, and often the collective aspect of our fallenness is much more significant. So, and then the third issue is we're called to be reconciled to God, ourselves, and others. So, recognizing all these kingdom principles, I want to do a deeper dive on how do a lot of these leadership principles change, and how do you need to adapt them? What are new principles to think through? So one of the most significant, let's just start with Clinton's The Making of a Leader. So he talks about these different phases of leadership, right? And a lot of those phases, will exist across race, class, and gender, right? But there's going to be different issues you're going to run into with them, right? So, and I talked about, the differences of life chances. So, he talks about the different phases. And one of the points that Clinton talks about is he says that very few people make it to convergent ministry. Well, he was talking about a white male audience largely the white middle class male audience. And if in his case, very few made it, ultimately the difference is as you go across race, class, and gender, the more of those dimensions and the farther you're outside of the dominant culture, the more barriers you're going to have as you go across each of these phases, right? So going from phase 1 to phase 2, that boundary, as he describes it, he calls it logistical, but really what it comes down to is funding. Can you afford to be in full-time ministry? And that's very difficult if you're creating your own ministry, especially, if you're not in the dominant culture. But also there's cultural biases, in getting hired and things along those lines. And we'll talk about those in later weeks. And then going from phase 2 to phase 3, general ministry, in phase 2, there's just going to be a lot more conflict, a lot more perpetual trauma if you're leading in diverse and under-resourced communities. There's going to be a higher risk of burnout. It's going to be more difficult to get funding that you're going to need to get to focus ministry. And then there's going to be another boundary, to have a convergent ministry. It can be helpful to have cultural convergence. And what I mean by that, for middle-class white male, so say someone's called to plant a church in suburban white church, it's going to be easier for them to find cultural convergence as a white male because there's not going to be these differences across dimensions, cultural dimensions for them. Whereas if a African-American woman was trying to plant a church in the suburbs and wanted to have a white church because that's what she felt she was called to, there's going to be a lot more barriers to that, right? So anyway, so that becomes much more significant to think through how do these things change and how do you work through that. So I want to talk about a tool that I often use. It's the race, class, and gender triangle. And whenever you talk about finding your place, using this triangle can be helpful. And one of the things that I found in a general principle is that the inherent fallenness of society creates overwhelming forces for justice-oriented churches and ministries to only effectively address one of the three. Now, let me talk about some examples of that. So I was a part of a church or a denomination, actually, that Assemblies of God, which historically, and it's somewhat changing, but historically, Assemblies of God has been the largest denomination for people from poor white or working class communities. And that while I was at that church, that actually met my class dimension. But a lot of Assemblies of God aren't doing as well on the racial dimension or on the gender dimension, right? So I love Assemblies of God, but that's just not as much of their strength. Even though the church I went to in Boston was actually doing really well. It was led by a person of color, Puerto Rican, and there was only a few white people there. It was probably 80 or 90%, Black and Latino. But a lot of lower income churches may not be doing, especially poor white, may not be doing as well on race. So then there's other churches that will, especially mainline denominations, might be doing better on gender. They're doing, mainline denominations in general do the best on gender, but mainline denominations often are the least diverse and often are the most upper class, right? And I'm not talking about what people say. I'm talking about what actually is in the congregation whenever I'm talking about these things, because everyone's going to say, okay, we're supportive across race, class, and gender, but what I'm actually talking about is what the facts are. Who actually shows up at the church, and then a lot of ethnic churches might have more issues around gender or class at times. So there might be, there's a black megachurch that I was familiar with, but it was largely, middle class and above. And they had a harder time effectively serving lower income black community. They didn't, they also had a harder time with across gender. Now, this isn't, I don't want to promote stereotypes to say that, all black churches are going to be, like this, or all, poor white churches are going to be like this. But what I'm saying is, on average, there is what I would describe as this cultural tide that's going to pull them. And I've seen a few organizations that will do two of these. There's a Latino church in Boston called Leon de Huda, and they do class and race extremely well. They're one of the only ones I can think of out of thousands that I'm familiar with. I've never seen one that did race, class, and gender well. And I am familiar with thousands of organizations, so they might exist somewhere out there, but in my opinion right now, they're a little bit like unicorns. And I'm not saying what they talk about. What I'm saying is in their actual leadership and in their, culture. So now outside of this, if you actually read the bottom line, this says justice-oriented churches and ministries, right? So most of the white churches are going to be what I call dominant culture organizations. So they're not doing well on any of these three dimensions. So part of why this is important is it can be challenging to find your place across race, class, and gender. So I talked about the importance of leadership convergence and cultural convergence. So many people have multiple dimensions of themselves, and they will need to seek out different communities that have a core competency in each dimension. So problems will occur when individuals can't find places to serve all the key dimensions of who God's made them to be. So, a black middle-class woman who's called to serve the poor, she may have to go different places to get the different dimensions. And I'll talk a little bit more about examples. So another problem occurs when individuals try to force organizations to meet their needs and dimensions that the organizations are where you're too far from the organization's core competency. So this happened to me whenever I started to come back to God through a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that church was one of the most elite churches. They consisted mainly of, Harvard, MIT, extremely high educated groups, and across social class, they just weren't able to meet my needs. And I tried to make them do that, and it didn't work well, right? So I created conflict, and then the third area is individuals where they may not recognize that moving the culture of an organization's going to be a fairly painful act, and it's going to be an act of sacrificial service to the organization, but will not likely serve your needs. So part of the idea there is if you're going to try to move an organization, you need to be fed somewhere else, right? Because if you're trying to be fed where you're trying to have change, often that can be fairly difficult. So, now I think I'm at a better spot. My needs are being met. If I needed to go to an organization and help them move forward across social class, I'm getting my needs met somewhere else. And the same thing might happen, across people on racial reconciliation. It's going to be easier to do that if your needs are getting met somewhere else. And it can also be difficult if you're married and you have a difference across race, class, and obviously all marriages have differences across gender, but trying to balance those communities. So, my wife, for a period of time, she went to a mainline denomination small group because that helped, her meet the gender difference. And for me, for 10 years, we were going to a lower class dominant church. And now I'm actually going to a suburban church that meets, my wife's, class needs better. So that can be a challenge. So let me talk about and just use my own example of trying to find my place. So white, working class background, male, called to serve the poor. So there's in across two of those dimensions, I worked very intentionally to grow. I was supervised by African Americans. My first ministry was based out of African American church. I was immersed in the African American community. I've probably lived 3/4 of my life being a cultural minority within a larger within that subculture. Being mentored by African Americans and friendships and doing tons of reading. Probably read 50 plus books. Cross gender, same type of thing. Being mentored by women. Counseling was really helpful in opening up my heart and understanding a lot of the gender dynamics in my marriage. Being married to a strong leader, my wife has a doctorate, and learning how to relate effectively to her, reading a lot, and being supervised by women. My home base largely is City Vision. For 10 years, I attended a working class church in Boston. And I've done a lot of reading to grow my own understanding of social class. And in serving dominant culture organizations, there's been two things that I've done recently. I'm leading a small group in my church, and that's a stretch for me. And I'm also have to work really hard to get an education so that I can more effectively serve dominant culture organizations. So I work a lot on, I'm continuing to learn on fundraising. I'm continuing to learn on board development. I ultimately got my doctorate largely to more effectively serve in that community. So that's an example for me. So let me use another example. So I've known many Black female leaders, and some that have been called to serve the poor. So in this example, Black female leader might go serve in a secular social service organization. So she's called to serve the poor. So that's going to help. And she might go to a graduate program at a Christian university, and that's going to help her, grow in her gender identity. And then she might attend a middle-class Black church. And, the black lines represent paths to finding your place to safety. The green arrows represent steps that bring growth or acts of service towards others. So she might go and train across race and gender to dominant culture organizations. That's something that is, viewed, she probably views more as an act of missionary service, right? So another example might be a white middle-class female leader who's called to serve the poor. So she might work at an evangelical homeless shelter at a rescue mission or Salvation Army. She might attend a mainline denomination church that's going to help meet her gender identity. And she might speak on women in leadership at conferences, and she might have experiences where she's supervised across race, immersed in a community where that's different from her culture, where she's being mentored and have friendships and reading across race. So that's an example of that. So some of the principles of finding cultural convergence is when you can find an organization that matches the primary dimensions of your cultural identity. Often you might have to create that if you're not in the dominant culture. So the likelihood of finding cultural convergence in a single organization dramatically increases the more similar you are to the dominant group. So some others may find cultural convergence by starting your own organization, but that's going to be limited by cultural differences with sources of funding. Funders generally tend to fund people who are aligned with their cultural values, or a lack of critical mass because a cultural niche is too small. And there's also systemic barriers to cultural convergence may make it difficult to achieve leadership convergence, as I'd mentioned. And for many, the best solution is going to be to find different groups to meet different elements of identity, similar to being bivocational, as explained in previous slides. So now I want to talk, there's an optional reading on ethnic identity development, and social identity development is similar to ethnic identity development, but it's across race, class, and gender. And we're going to have an assignment, and in the assignment, we're going to be talking about you writing your own plan for how you can grow in your cross-cultural effectiveness. So one way of looking at that is to look at where are you across race, class, and gender for each of these dimensions. And then, you might say, I'm at stage 1, I didn't even realize a lot of these things you're talking about in this course. And then you're going to make a decision that, I need to grow to learn more. So recognizing that stage 2 is going to be more about head learning. And then stage 3 will be more about heart and hand learning and thinking through the dimensions for that. So this can be a helpful tool. In the assignment overview, one of the things that we're going to have you do is to draw a cross-cultural sphere of influence. So this is my own cross-cultural sphere of influence, and this came out of the cross-cultural leadership lessons. But my tier 1, and this is what I'd say is my people, where I have to have very little cross-cultural effort, is working with white and Black working class communities. Then my tier 2 are people that I can effectively lead and manage and supervise, but requires a little bit more effort. So people from poor white background, white middle class, and second generation Latino, Latina, Asian, or working class. And then the next tier is Black, poor middle class, white upper middle class, women, first generation poor, or middle class, Latino, Latina, or Asian, and international middle class. And I can serve this third tier. It's more difficult for me. And what we're going to have you do in your assignment is you're going to go, the first part is you're going to draw these own groups for yourself, and you can drag these around and make copies. And then in the second part, you're going to write a 2 to 4 page paper identifying where you need to grow using these tools. So, the first part, you're going to talk about, okay, using this diagram, here's where I need to grow. The second is you're going to look at the social identity development table that I just showed you, and you're going to reflect at where you are across race, class, and gender, and then think about what the goals are there and what do you need to grow in. And that can help provide you with some ideas. And I also want you to reflect on the race, class, and gender triangle and in this presentation, and where are the dimensions of yourself, answering 2 questions. Where are the dimensions of yourself where you need to seek safety for those dimensions? Do you feel like you get all of those met? You might describe how, or are there areas where you need to find more? And are there ways that God's calling you to take steps of growth or service across race, class, and gender? So, and follow APA format for this. And if you have any questions, ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot. Bye.